Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. It gives you everything you need in one place for free, and you can use it right from your phone or computer. The creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so that it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for free, which is my favorite feature. It can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. You can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Download the Anchor app or go to Anchor FM to get started. Welcome to the Infinite Content Podcast. In today's episode, we're going to be ranking the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Normally, I cover news regarding pop culture on this show, but I figured with Endgame, Avengers Endgame coming out a week from now, I figured it would be a good time to offer my ranking of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and where I see the movies and where they fit, really. My plan is once Endgame comes out and I've seen it, which I'm going to see it on opening night, is I will kind of place it in my ranking, though I have a pretty decent inkling that it's going to be number one. But the way I see it, it might not be. So we're going to go through my list, and the movie in dead last is Thor: The Dark World. I think this is a pretty common ranking for a lot of people when it comes to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And it's just simply because it's kind of just a boring and bland movie. There's not that much about this movie that's actually very interesting. It's not that it's inherently a terrible movie. It's just boring and uninspired. The plot's just not that interesting. The villains are weak. And nothing of real consequence happens in the movie. It just sort of exists. And there's little memorable from it. I actually recently rewatched it, and I still don't remember that much of what happens in it because it's just so boring. As far as I know, there was a lot of production issues with the movie, so I guess in that regard, that's kind of why it was a bit messy. But honestly, this is a movie I see myself never watching again because I just can't see a good reason to do it. The next movie on the list is Doctor Strange. Admittedly, I haven't rewatched Doctor Strange in quite some time, so I may have a different opinion of it at some point. But I've seen it once, and I didn't see it in theaters, actually. And upon rewatching it, or watching it for the first time, I found it just kind of bland as well, alongside Thor: The Dark World. And I just didn't find the character that engaging. It was just an okay origin movie, nothing very special. And again, it just sort of exists within the MCU. I sort of just felt like Doctor Strange was far more interesting in Infinity War. I enjoyed his character a lot more in that movie compared to Doctor Strange itself. So the next movie on the list is The Incredible Hulk. This movie feels so utterly out of place in regards to pretty much all of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I think it's for pretty obvious reasons. Edward Norton is in the movie, and he's not the Incredible Hulk or Bruce Banner anymore. And it's interesting. I actually have the trailer up right now, and there's literally footage in this trailer that is not even in the movie. So that's interesting. This movie just feels so out of place, which probably has a lot to do with the fact that, Universal made this movie. And it sort of feels shoehorned into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I kind of feel like Disney just sort of likes to pretend it doesn't exist, really. Personally, I like Mark Ruffalo more as the Hulk and Bruce Banner anyhow. But this movie isn't, again, inherently a terrible movie. It's entertaining enough. It holds up okay. It just feels out of place within the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the next movie on the list is Thor. And when it comes to Thor, it feels like a very Phase 1 Marvel Cinematic Universe movie. It's not, again, that it's a bad movie. In fact, really, I don't think any of the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies are bad. But when it comes to this movie, it just the tones are sort of off. It's sort of just the scenes between Earth and the ones that are in Asgard, they just feel so different from each other, and I feel like they don't mesh very well. And this movie just is again not that interesting. It just isn't that memorable, and yeah, it's just Thor, you know? I just don't think Thor is as interesting of a character as Marvel wants Thor to be in a lot of ways, is sort of the issue with Thor. The next movie on the list is Avengers Age of Ultron. This is actually the movie that made me sort of sick of Marvel movies for a little while, because I saw it in theaters and I was just like, this is just too much. There's just so much going on in this movie in like a really bad way. There's so many characters being introduced. It didn't have the light, fluffy goodness that was the original Avengers movie. It was an overstuffed movie with a pretty decent villain and some interesting like things going on, and a lot of ramifications for the MCU onward with what happens in Sokovia. But the movie itself just has too much going on and too many set pieces and too many action pieces that don't actually move the plot forward. They're just sort of there to try to entertain you. And I feel like a lot of Marvel action scenes actually have importance often in the movies. In this movie, they just felt overstuffed and like they just wanted to exist because they had to exist. And the movie's just too long. Like 20 minutes could have easily been left on the cutting room floor, I feel like. And you just have characters like Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver that are introduced, and they're just there and play a very strange role, especially Quicksilver, who's just killed. And you almost have to wonder why they even bothered to put the character in the movie in the first place. The next movie on the list is Captain America, the First Avenger. I unfortunately want to like Captain America, the First Avenger more. I want it to be higher up on the list because I feel like at its emotional core, it is wonderful. It's a very, very emotionally engaging movie, but it unfortunately suffers from Phase 1 Marvel movie issues because it has some choppy editing. Some of the action scenes don't hold up. Some of the way the plot plays out just doesn't totally make sense at times. The Red Skull is sort of used poorly as a villain ultimately by the end of the movie. And it's just unfortunate because I do feel like as an origin story, Captain America's origin story is awesome and interesting and fascinating. And it's just a beautiful, like, this movie's very, like, sort of almost an Americana, World War II movie. And it's unfortunate that it suffers from Phase 1 Marvel issues of just choppy production and things that it couldn't escape from when, Marvel Studios was sort of working out the kinks still. The next movie on the list is Iron Man 2, which is a movie that gets way too much flack. Because generally, it's a pretty entertaining movie, Iron Man 2. It is not a bad movie by any means, but a lot of people tend to put it towards the bottom of the list, and I guess in my list, it sort of is. But I actually really look at this movie very fondly. Every time I watch it, I'm like, damn, this movie's fun. I just love Robert Downey Jr. so much as Iron Man that I can't escape from just how fun this movie is, just by default. There's just a lot of fun scenes. Whiplash isn't a great villain, but Sam Rockwell is, as Justin Hammer. Again, it's kind of an inconsequential movie, and again, a movie still sort of working out the kinks for what they want these movies to be, but it's still just a really fun movie. So the next movie on the list is Guardians of the Galaxy, the first Guardians of the Galaxy. I rewatched this one recently as well, and it's a really good movie. It's very funny, and the way they made these pretty obscure characters worked together and make it work for a mainstream audience is absolutely incredible. My main issue is that I do feel like it sort of drags toward the latter half of the movie in terms of there just being a lot of action pieces and just being over bloated at times, to the point where I'm getting a little bored in all actuality with the overabundance of action scenes. But damn, is it still a really fun movie. And once we get to Guardians 2, which I think is the superior movie, it sort of works out all the kinks. So the next movie on the list is Iron Man 3, which is a pretty controversial pick. I feel like a lot of people put this toward the bottom because they have a lot of issues with the portrayal of the Mandarin. I don't personally have much of a basis for the Mandarin character, so it didn't bother me what they did. And frankly, I think Ben Kingsley's performance when the reveal is given of the Mandarin is so goddamn funny that it doesn't really even matter to me that they changed this character into something sort of goofy and silly, because Iron Man 3 is still a really entertaining movie, and I love the way it deals with the PTSD that Tony Stark was facing after the Avengers. You're sort of getting that first inklings of how there is damage being done by these heroes to some extent, both to their own mental health, sort of, and, obviously more with Civil War and what damage is truly being done on a more of a surface, actual human level. So Iron Man 3 is sort of the first movie that deals with that, and I think it does a really, really good job. And again, it's also just a really fun movie. I love the style Shane Black brought to the movie. I thought it was fun. I think it would have been fun to see Jon Favreau do another one, but it's okay that he didn't. So the next movie on the list is Ant-Man. Ant-Man is basically a comedy. It's basically a superhero comedy, but it's a really fun superhero comedy. I would say, again, it suffers some issues of having sort of a bland villain, and some of the just, it drags a little bit here and there sort of situation, but that doesn't change the fact that it's one hell of a funny movie, and Michael Peña's character is just incredible, and Paul Rudd just as a whole playing a superhero is one of the best things that has ever happened in the MCU. And the next movie on the list is Ant-Man and the Wasp, a movie that I think got a little understated because it was sort of shoved in between, coming right after Infinity War. But basically it's just Ant-Man again, the first one, but a little bit better, which is kind of why I put it right after. I think it's a bit more entertaining and, again, suffers from sort of a bland villain problem, but still a really damn fun movie. The next movie on the list is Black Panther, which I think everyone sort of seems to love this movie. I haven't seen really too many people badmouth it. The only real problem I have with it is some of the sort of CG during some of the fight scenes is kind of iffy, especially for a newer MCU movie. But it's still a really good movie with one of the best villains in the MCU by far. Black Panther is never really a character I knew much about, as somewhat of a comic book reader, but seeing him in this movie, it is just spectacular, and it's such a fun movie. The next movie on the list is Captain Marvel, which I don't think too many people love Captain Marvel as much as I did. Obviously, there's a lot of political issues with this movie in terms of people talking about it and sort of denouncing it by default because of comments Brie Larson made, which weren't really controversial at all. And I'm not quite sure why people were offended by it. But that's a whole nother situation. It's just hard for me to grasp why people could have possibly been offended by the very little she even said in the first place. And how just non-controversial the statements truly were. But again, these are people who don't really want diversity, I would say. But Captain Marvel for me was a really fun movie. I thought it was hilarious. I love the dynamic between Captain Marvel and Nick Fury. And seeing Coulson too was really fun, and the friendship between Captain Marvel and her friend, whose name is escaping me right now, but it's just so good. I just loved it. To me, this whole movie was fun. There was really almost never a moment that I felt bored or disinterested in what was going on, and I think it's one of the best origin movies that the MCU has had so far. The next movie on the list is the original 2008 Iron Man. This movie started it all, and it's amazing how well it holds up compared to the rest of Phase 1. Right from the get-go, it just launches you into this story basically critiquing Tony Stark's involvement in the military-industrial complex. And it's at that moment that you quickly realize how important these movies actually are. Whether people want to denounce them as silly action movies, they actually do have something to say. There are things going on in these movies that are important. And just getting introduced to Tony Stark and Robert Downey Jr.'s amazing, incredible performance just makes this movie hold up so well. Obadiah Stane is sort of a somewhat weak villain, but I'm like able to ignore that just because of how great this is as an introduction to the MCU. And how great Robert Downey Jr. is, especially considering this was the first movie and just how ridiculously well it still holds up. The next movie on the list is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. The first time I saw Guardians of the Galaxy 2, I liked it, but I wasn't in love with it. But then I rewatched it, and then I rewatched it one more time. And through those two rewatchings, I realized just how fun this movie is. It is one of the funniest movies in the MCU by far. It's a pretty inconsequential movie. It doesn't really do much in terms of the MCU as a whole, but it is just one of the most fun movies in the MCU. And that is just no doubt in my mind. No question about it. It is entertaining scene by scene, and then the whole... what they do with Yondu and Star-Lord's dad is just, it's perfect. It has an emotional core to it while being hilarious, and I cannot wait for Guardians 3, and I'm so happy James Gunn is back. The next movie on the list is the original Avengers movie, the last movie of Phase 1. And I often used to hold The Avengers as my number one movie of the MCU. But in my most recent rewatching of the movie this year, I sort of realized, not that it's a bad movie, but I realized that it suffers from some Phase 1 issues. The opening scene is very awkward. The way the movie opens is just weird. I hate, this is sort of a small thing, but the screen ratio that they decided to go with, it sort of fills the whole frame. I don't know the exact ratio name or the number, I guess. But it fills the whole frame, and it sort of gives it a weird TV movie feel. And I think that was a huge mistake on their part to use that ratio. But still, this movie is hilarious. Scene by scene, there's just joke after joke after joke, and that's why it's so entertaining. But on top of that, you're just seeing these characters come together for the first time, and all things considered, it could have failed miserably as a movie. And instead of doing that, it didn't do it at all. It was amazing. And seeing it opening weekend when it came out, I still hold that movie theater experience as probably the best experience I've had in a movie theater. Because everyone was just so excited to see this movie, and the excitement was just insane. And it's just such an entertaining movie. It's just one of the most infinitely rewatchable movies of the MCU by far. The next movie on the list is Spider-Man Homecoming. I was so excited when Spider-Man came back to Disney, and they were able to use the character. And I think Tom Holland is the best Spider-Man that has ever been cast. I think he's perfect, and I think the villain use of the Vulture in this movie is fantastic. Michael Keaton gives such a stellar performance. But I have just a very big attachment to the Spider-Man character. He's probably my favorite Marvel character. And just, this movie for me, gets Spider-Man right, and I love the way they incorporated it into the MCU by having Tony Stark sort of become the Uncle Ben character. They skipped the Uncle Ben thing, and I'm okay with that. We've seen that over and over again. We know that origin story. So why not do something that actually makes it work in the MCU? And I think they did that perfectly. So the fourth movie on the list is Captain America: Winter Soldier. This is the first time the Russo brothers directed an MCU movie, and god damn, did they just hit it out of the park. This is just an amazing espionage spy thriller. It's something so different compared to the rest of the MCU. And it's just so cool. It's such a cool movie. It still has some semblance of humor within it, but at the same time, it's pretty much a deadly serious movie for most of its runtime. And it deals with this, the Bucky Barnes story and the dynamic between Bucky and Cap, and does such a great job of it. And then on top of that, you have these great twists with Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. being infiltrated by Hydra, and how great that all is. And it's just such a fun and different movie for the MCU. Number 3 on the list is Thor Ragnarok. If someone told me that a Thor movie would be this high up on my list of MCU movies, I'd tell them they were wrong. But Thor Ragnarok finally got Thor right. Stop taking it seriously. Because that's always been the problem, I feel like. In the other 2 Thor movies, there's so much seriousness in it for a character that is fundamentally silly and kind of ridiculous. And Thor Ragnarok just throws all of that seriousness out of the window and makes a comedy. It's like Guardians of the Galaxy. It's like AntMan. It is a superhero buddy cop movie with Hulk and Thor. And it pays off. You have great characters like Korg that are hilarious, and Valkyrie, and a decent villain. Not one of the best, but it's so easy to ignore that when the humor just is so on point for the entire movie. And this is by far one of the most fun movies in the MCU. And again, another one that's so infinitely rewatchable. So number 2 on the list is Captain America: Civil War. Or as I like to honestly think of it, as Avengers Civil War, because it basically is an Avengers movie with, I guess some deeper ties with Captain America, with the Winter Soldier and Bucky playing such a big role. But I still feel like fundamentally it's basically an Avengers movie, just them kind of fighting each other. But this is a really good example of these comic book movies dealing with sort of political dynamics in a big, big way, and what, if these heroes really did exist in the real world, what would happen politically. And seeing, Captain America and Iron Man fight about it. And not only is it an amazing action movie with that amazing airport scene, they introduce new characters with Black Panther and Spider-Man and do a really good job of it. It's the opposite of the Avengers 2 problem, where these characters felt forced in, whereas with Civil War, they did not feel forced into the movie. It felt like they made sense for the movie. And I just think the way this movie sort of turns everything upside down for the MCU is a big deal. And number 1 on the list, I guess, is pretty obvious, but it's Avengers Infinity War. It's just fundamentally the best movie in the MCU. There's almost no argument I can make against it. It's basically a perfect movie. I think it drags maybe a little bit with the Thor making his new weapon, the Stormbreaker. For me, that's the only part where it lags, and that's literally the only flaw I can think of for this movie. I guess also the CG for the when Hulk, or Bruce Banner, I guess, wears the Hulkbuster suit, it's pretty bad. But otherwise, Thanos is the best villain in the MCU. They portrayed Thanos perfectly from the comics. They just do such a good job. Josh Brolin's performance is something else. And on top of that, the way they managed to bring all these characters together is just unbelievable. It is one of the greatest accomplishments in film in a lot of ways, because it's so unprecedented. This is something that's never been done before, and they did it. And Endgame's going to do it again. And the Russo brothers deserve a huge round of applause for the way they've been able to do this and handle all these characters and make it somehow work. There's so many kinks. You see the kinks and the growing pains in something like Avengers 2 and bringing these teams together and bringing these characters together and how it can be a challenge and how it can sometimes not work. But Infinity War shows how to make that work. And they do such a good job in not only making an interesting and fun and entertaining movie, it's also hilarious and dark and has actual stakes for the entire universe in the movie. And Endgame is going to just show more of that. So that's my ranking of the MCU. Let me know what your ranking of the MCU would be. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm so excited for Endgame, and that is pretty much it.